Giving up on my brother. All right, we're going to get started. Even though my brother's not here to introduce me, because he's introduced me enough. So we're going to get going and get this over with. And, well, he's indisposed. All right. There's Pat now. He's coming up. Before I forget, Patrick, you're here. There's still a bunch of these that we need to get rid of. These are the dinosaur books. Dinosaurs, Marvels of God's Design. If you haven't looked at the pictures, it's worth it for the pictures alone, my old boss used to say. So, anyway, a few pictures of my kids in here, too, for scale. And it's a pretty good book. That one's still out there. We don't want to ship them back if we can help it. And we have about 4 of these left, these carved in stone books. Now, today's lecture, there's a whole chapter on oil and coal in here. So if you want to know more about the details of coal and oil and how coal and oil really is young and really is a product of the flood only, that's in here as well. So there's an Ice Age chapter in here. There's a chapter about pretty much everything in here except dinosaurs. Well, we talk about the dinosaurs, but specifically the dinosaur book over here. We have these 4.5-pound books that'll hold your door open. If nothing else, they make a great doorstop. Or you can swap flies with them. Yeah, hold the TV up higher. If you're zooming or something like that, you need a book underneath to lift your computer up a little higher. These are good. You know, you don't want to be these people on TV where they're too close or they're looking down on themselves. And so think about how it's going to look. All right, well, we're going to start today. Last talk, we're all getting a little silly. Pat and I always were, still are, fracturing the fables of oil. And so some of this I'm going to go through and talk about things. As an oil and gas geologist, I was told a lot of things. I was told the oil in Wyoming is 150 million years old. It's just sitting there waiting for us to tap into it. I'm like, okay. And I said, well, how can it be? A couple of guys, once they got to know me, I told them my views on the earth, how I think the earth is much younger. They're like, Tim, you're nuts. I'm like, our models only work if you put millions of years in the bottom. You know, they do these studies of how fast oil can mature and all that. And so we just put thousands of years and it works the same. And they're like, oh. Well, they never thought about that. They could just change the years easily because the years are really meaningless. So we'll see today that oil can form very, very quickly and didn't take that long to form. And it actually is biodegrading very quickly as well. And so if we don't get that oil out of there, it's also leaking up underneath the Gulf of Mexico. It's leaking off California.
Gulf of America.
Well, Gulf of America now, yes. I published a paper already on that. I call it Gulf of America. And I put in parentheses, formerly Gulf of Mexico.
Just kidding.
And so, well, when you work the GOM all the time, it's hard to change your name. But anyway, nonetheless, there's a lot of oil that's seeping up naturally because it's leaking to the surface. So there's all these oil deposits down there that are biodegrading and escaping away. They didn't need geologists in the early days. They just drilled near seeps. The very first well drilled in Pennsylvania was near an oil seep, so it's coming to the surface. And so they just drilled into these. In Texas, the same way. So you just drill near oil seeps and you could hit oil for the most part. Then after those were drilled up, and they're like, oh, now what are we going to do? So they started doing some science and figuring out the traps they need. So we'll talk about this a bit. You've heard about dinosaur soft tissues too much today and yesterday. Shows the oil is, the soft tissue is not that old. But we have so little soft tissue, so what? We have 130 papers now where they found soft tissue. They're like, that's not much. But what if you had enough to fill a barrel, 42-gallon barrel, or hundreds of barrels, or millions of barrels? We actually have billions of barrels of oil. And all of it really is like soft tissue. It's all organic compounds. They can't survive. You can't survive for thousands or millions of years. And so here we have the oil. This goes through about 2020. You can see the oil deposits in different countries, Middle East, Far East, everything else. Here's North America at the bottom. You see it jumps up here about 2001 when we started fracking. Suddenly our oil reserves went up by 3 in North America, mostly out of Texas, in the Williston Basin, and a few of these other locations. So fracking has really increased the amount of oil. People over here were thinking, oh, we're running out of oil, we're all going to die. We hit peak oil over here, it's all going downhill. All of a sudden, a little more technology, boom, there it is. If oil is really that old, those rocks in West Texas are really 250 million years old, they should frack into that and there should be no oil left. You get to find billions and billions of barrels of oil in these rocks that are 250 million years old that should have produced the oil a long, long, long time ago. So why are they still finding oil? Nobody asked that. Oil is young, and it's not from dinosaurs, even though you're taught it's from dinosaurs. It's from marine algae and marine plankton buried in the flood. So today, marine algae and plankton settles to the bottom, decays, gets eaten by things. It's not depositing this organic, rich material. And only during the flood do you bury things fast enough, even shales, buried by moving water. You bury all these organic compounds in there and makes these black shale rocks. The Antrim Shale up in northern Michigan is an example of that. There's lots of, some of it's 10% organic. That's what makes it so black and oil-prone, oil-rich as we go along. So there's 4 fables about oil I want to go over today. One, that oil is bad for the environment. Being an oil and gas person, I'm like, what? How can you say it's bad for the environment? It runs our world. Our economy is running on oil. Without oil, we'd go back to the Stone Age. It really would. It can't go back now. Oil forms slowly. That's another myth. People think it takes a long time for oil to form. Oil can form, we'll see, in less than an hour under the right conditions. Third and finally, oil can survive for millions of years. People have told me that when I worked for the oil company. Oil in the Gulf of Mexico is 15 million years old. In Wyoming, it's 150 million years old. When you think about it, it's impossible because it's like soft tissue. It can't survive that long. We'll talk a bit more about that. And fourth and finally, oil existed before the flood. People use this to criticize Noah's flood. They say the pitch on the ark obviously was oil, so therefore we had oil before the flood. But we'll see that's not true. The Hebrew word doesn't mean oil at all. So we'll talk about that a bit as well. All right, Elon Musk had this way back in 2022. He said, we need to use oil and gas in the short term because otherwise civilization will crumble. That's the truth. Some of the oil and gas guys will say this. Without oil, runs our economy. Oil prices is what causes inflation. Oil prices go up. Shipping costs more. Everything goes up. That's what causes the bulk of the inflation. When oil prices go down, prices go down. It's all about the barrel of oil. So where does that oil come from? It all comes from the flood. God knew we'd need that energy today. He knew we would need them in the 20th century, the 21st century to make our lives better. He provided all this during the flood. The judgment of the flood, he was thinking about you, thinking about me, that we need these resources. So he provided all these dead animals, plankton, all buried, algae, plants buried, all this material, all the plant material making coal, all that was buried in the flood year. And we use those resources today, burning that. And it's really not that bad. 2023, they predicted, I'm not sure if it happened or not, they predicted the world oil demand would climb to its highest point ever, record high in 2023. Down here, China alone making up more than half the global increase. So, and of course, China's never involved in these climate change discussions. They just get to do whatever they want. And so if the government really cared, they put the clamps down on China. So you got to obey these rules too, but it's more politics than it is science, unfortunately. This is our energy resources that we use. This is from 2020, it hasn't changed. And if you notice, all these in green, here's coal, here's oil, here's natural gas. Well over 3/4 of our energy is supplied by coal, oil, and natural gas. So the so-called fossil fuels are really what gives us our energy. And it's consistent energy. The big Texas snowmageddon they talked about a few years ago where they lost powers because they didn't have any wind. And the windmills didn't work, so they lost about 10% of their power because they were relying on unreliable wind energy. And so the power grids were going off, and Ted Cruz flew off to Mexico. Well, I don't really care. You know how people make a big deal out of it. He left us. Like, well, it's okay. But we never lost power, did we? Because we were on a grid with a hospital. We were just fortunate. Live in the right apartment at the right place near a hospital, so we never lost our power. People were losing their power, and it was below zero. I think, at one point or close to it. It was pretty cool. Killed a lot of plants. A lot of the plants around our apartment complex. But if they were using more coal and oil and natural gas, they wouldn't have had that problem. But they use a lot. Well, again, over three-fourths of our energy today comes from coal, oil, and natural gas. And this is the air pollution with use of oil and natural gas since 1970, since the President Nixon, those guys signed in the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. All this was going on. I mean, he started the EPA and everything. And he was a Republican. But here's the amount of pollutants in the air dropping down. We're burning all this coal, burning all this fossil fuels, all this oil and natural gas, and the energy, air pollution is going down. Total carbon dioxide emissions. Here's the total emissions up here from 1990 to 2020. Coal and oil, actually coal's going down because we're burning less coal. The natural gas and petroleum stuff's actually dropping a little bit at the end, so total emissions are actually going down. So we're burning it cleaner, I guess, if you want to call it that, maybe, but it's really not that bad. So here's the bottom line here. The World Climate Declaration was signed by 1,100 scientists. It said CO2 is not a pollutant. It's essential to all life on Earth, especially the plants. More CO2 is favorable for nature, greening our planet. Right now it's about 0.04%. 0.04% of the atmosphere. During the flood, or before the flood, I think it was probably maybe 1% or more. I just made everything lush and green. That's what made all that coal. Sequestered all into these plants. A lot of it got sequestered into the limestone that was formed in the flood year, because CO2 is a big component of calcium carbonate, CaCO3. And so I believe that's what's eroding all over the world. Those red wall limestones we talked about that's exposed all over the world, different limestones at different levels of the flood. All that weathering is releasing CO2. That's what's making a steady increase. So to have a steady increase, you need a steady source, and I think it's the weathering of all these limestones deposited in the flood. But that's just my philosophy. They found out about a year or so ago, I wrote an article about this, they found that shale is releasing CO2 to the atmosphere as it weathers. But the evolutionary scientists haven't looked at limestone yet, which I think is the major contributor. But they thought shale was absorbing CO2, but it's actually releasing CO2, and they were shocked to find this out. But there's all these rocks that have sequestered CO2, changed the Earth's atmosphere from the pre-flood to the post-flood, and it's all locked in the rocks, and now that's seeping back into the atmosphere. I think so it's not your fault. You can look in the mirror and go, it's not my fault. Okay, it's just happening. There's fluctuations, and the Lord Jesus told us in Genesis that there'd be day and night and seasons till the day he returns. And so he's not going to let the earth fall apart. He has checks and balances in there. The ocean does things. I mean, the way he built our world, no scientist understands even half of it. That's why our weather models are so bad. When they predict rain one day in Texas, it won't rain, and then when they don't predict it, it rains. The very morning it says there'll be no rain today, and it poured that afternoon. I'm like, how did they be that bad? Because we don't really understand what's really going on in the world. We think we do, but the more we learn, the more you realize you don't know. So CO2 is very, very important, though. We need CO2. Plants need that. That's their oxygen. They make oxygen for us. The more plants, the more oxygen for us. And so it's all a beneficial system. CO2 is not the answer, not the enemy. And then to make one EV battery, which some of you are driving in your Teslas around, look at all the stuff you got to mine. 250 tons of ore and tremendous amounts of water to process all this stuff. That's why I didn't get the water out here. Here's a conventional car, all the steel and plastic. Again, half of our oil is used to make plastic. We wouldn't have any plastic without oil. You wouldn't have a cell phone. You wouldn't have a computer. You wouldn't have half your car parts. Anything made out of plastic is all from oil. So Noah didn't have plastic because there was no oil at the time. But he had lots of other stuff. But look at all the stuff you need to make these batteries. Tremendous amount for one battery, one lithium battery. So it's not really, you add this up, it's not that advantageous. So I think oil, good old-fashioned oil is still good for us. It's not all that bad. You can disagree with me if you want. This is the most controversial talk I give. And so I don't normally give this one, but I see the people in the back looking angry, scowling, and that's okay. We can agree to disagree and still love each other as brothers and sisters in Jesus. But here's what fracking does. You go down and look 5,000 feet or more, they drill down, then they go horizontally. These fractures do not reach the surface. They don't come anywhere near the surface. They don't affect your drinking supply. You know, they show you these videos where they turn on the gas from the water and they light their faucet on fire. That's just nonsense. That's just, that was all set up. It wasn't even real. It's based on methane gas in their pond. Nothing to do with down here. These fractures don't go that far. We've been fracking wells vertically for years. Decades and decades they've been fracturing along here, and not one aquifer is destroyed. Even when the DNR guy gave a talk about 15 years ago, one of the guys in the DNR, your own Michigan Department of Natural Resources, gave a talk, and he said, I don't understand why people are against fracking, because it hasn't affected one aquifer that he knows of in the world, you know, in terms of drinking water. And he said it's all too deep. It's deeper than, because these fractures don't go that far. Now, there is a problem if you inject too much water into wells. Some of this wastewater they pull out, they have to re-inject back into the earth. And they sometimes put too much down one well, and they can cause earthquakes. So in Dallas, I felt my first earthquakes because they're injecting water in a nearby well in Irving, and we were watching the earthquake zip by in our office. Like, that's kind of cool. Moved to Dallas, feel my first earthquakes. Well, they stopped injecting about 5 years ago. There's been no more earthquakes ever since. And so if whoever owns these deep disposal wells makes a lot of money bringing in maybe some of you do. You get money by putting down your liquid hazardous waste down these deep wells. So instead of putting them in barrels like they used to do, and the barrels came floating back up, they now just inject it down a few thousand feet down. We don't know where it goes. That's all we're doing. We're injecting our liquid hazardous waste and wastewater into the earth, and it goes down here somewhere, and it can leak up along the well bore. You never know. They do the best they can, but fracking's not the problem. Fracking's allowed us to get a lot more oil out because they can go vertically through these vertical fractures and kind of seeps out that way. They can also see where they're going with seismic better now. We can actually see almost see the oil sometimes in the offshore areas of the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of America, whatever you want to call it. You can almost see it. There's these bright spots because the rocks out there aren't really rocks. They're just packed down sediment. And so the velocities are, when you hit oil, shows up in these little bright spots in there. But here's what we did again. Here's just the United States, looking at the lower 48 in Alaska. Here's what we had going. All of a sudden, fracking allowed us to move this stuff way up, called tight oil. You know, our projections jumped way up. They always do them going down, but they find more. So there seems to be, you know, it's not unlimited, of course. There's a certain amount of oil, but there's a lot of oil. Hundreds and hundreds of years worth of oil. Eventually, we will have to go to other resources. You know, we'll have to go to some other energy resource. But we can't just jump into that with just, well, let's just stop producing oil, like some politicians have said. It would shut down civilization as we know it. And so you've got to slowly transition to something else, which we should do. But here's the biggest oil fields in the country now. These are all West Texas. Eagle Ford's actually near where we're at in Dallas. This is the Wolf Camp stuff. This is the biggest oil fields in the United States. Prudhoe Bay is third. This is the Williston Basin. These are East Texas as well, or East and West Texas. So Texas has got more oil than any other state, and so that's why we keep it. But it's nothing to look at. It's all underground. All the cool stuff's underground in Texas. It's all these oil fields and traps you can get out there, mostly in West Texas, in these areas out there. But there's a lot of oil, more than Alaska gives you by far. And most of it's been found recently by the fracking and the horizontal well drilling that you're doing, thousands of feet down. And so it's not affecting anybody's aquifers and reservoirs that I know of. So oil is really not that bad for the environment. It's actually, it's a necessary resource that we need to supply our way of life, our civilization in the world. Keeps our cars going, keeps your plastic coming. It's all, you guys look shocked. Like, you're gonna throw stones at me. Okay, you can do that. Oil forms slowly. I can duck behind these books. Oil does not form slowly. It can form very quickly. Here's what you're taught in school. It takes millions of years for oil to form. They go this way. Dead animals sink to the bottom. For some reason, they don't decay, which they normally do. And then they get buried somehow. Again, they don't explain how. And then millions of years later, they drill in and they find oil. That's the story they teach you in school. They portray that idea. It takes millions of years. That's not true at all. Oil is really mostly from marine algae and plankton, buried in clay-rich shale rocks. The organics are what's called kerogen, the broken down parts. And you get algae and plankton, which gives you the different types of, they can do the chemistry of these, different types of type 1, type 2, whether one's algae, one's plankton. And most of these are trapped in shale, which are really fine-grained, clay-rich rocks that kind of can hold that organics. And so normally we can't get oil out of clay because it doesn't allow liquids to flow through it very well. That's why they have to frack it, hit vertical fractures. You hit hundreds and hundreds of vertical fractures, it kind of bleeds into the well bore that way, and that's why they have to go horizontally. There's a lot of vertical fractures. And so horizontal well drilling has allowed us to tap into these oil fields that normally we just drill through the shales and we can't do anything with them, just trying to fit sandstones, because sand allows fluids to flow through it better than clay does. And so it's all in there. Here's the shales around the world, big, huge basins of shale in red. The green ones are starting to develop. The rest of these they haven't even started on yet. So tremendous amounts of shale out there that we haven't even tapped with fracking. Some up here in Siberia, Australia. There's a lot offshore as well they don't show. But these big areas in northern Argentina, tremendous amounts of shale oil across Europe and places, Saudi Arabia. Again, not this area because there's no deposition there. It's almost crystalline rock. But here's the chemistry. People say, well, how can you say it's from algae? But it was from a dinosaur. Well, we can do chemistry. They've done this for years, oil and gas people. Here's the oil they produce, and here's the source rock. They break down the source rock, and they match it to the oil, and it's a perfect match. So they know exactly where the oil came from, and they can tie it back to the organic compounds, to the marine algae or the plankton that was buried in the flood year. So all this is probably in 1 year. So what's the Bible say about oil? It says, well, there was a flood. We talked about this last night. There was a major worldwide flood. Fountains of this great deep burst in Genesis 7:11. Intense rain for 40 days, and then the waters kept coming higher up to 150 days before the water crested, reached its highest point, catastrophic erosion and deposition. Everything perished, like it says in 2 Pt.3. They had the breath of life. Humans were wiped right off the face of the earth that God said he would do. Wiped them right off. All civilization destroyed. So we have no history for about 1,600 years. From the time of Cain and Abel, and a few things about, they worked with metals, Tubal Cain, a few things like that, and all of a sudden, boom, we're at the flood. So Pat, you need to preach on that. Those missing years, the missing history that God said, I'm not going to tell these people anything about it, that they were so wicked that he finally had to judge the earth and destroy it all. All right, here we go. Here's the progressive flood we talked about all along. And this is the real rocks in place today. They're still there. You can see the progression got more and more and more, and then there's a receding phase. In Australia, it does show the same thing. These are the volumes again. If you look at all the continents, all 6 continents, you'll see again, they start out minimal flooding early, just marine fossils, then it hits the land, get land animals, coal seams start showing up here, more land animals, more coal seams, different animals at different elevations. Same thing is true here. Still coal is being deposited throughout all these. Not so much here, but here. When you start to flood the land, you start to strip away the vegetation, you start to bury it, that became the coal. But you're getting plankton throughout. You can get oil from these rocks. So these Ordovician rocks and things here in Michigan actually can produce oil as well. Oil, or kerogen is called. It comes from kerogen, this little organic compounds, residual compounds. Must be buried fast like all fossils. Here's an ichthyosaur reptile, swimming reptile, with a live birth baby coming out, buried instantly. Might have been the burial that pushed the baby out, nobody knows. But this is not a broken tail. There's actually another fin up here that didn't have a tail. The bone went down, but there was still a fin up here that didn't have a bone. And so these are, but they found these all over England and all over the world, ichthyosaurs. These seem to be extinct too. Mosasaurs, swimming reptiles seem to be extinct. They're not really dinosaurs, they're just other animals that lived in the pre-flood world. They seem to have gone extinct after the flood. Again, everything has to be buried fast, just like dinosaurs to make a fossil. And marine algae has to be buried fast as well. So kerogen is solid, disseminated organic mass that if you bury it deep enough from the earth between 60 to 120 degrees Celsius, basically about 5,000 to 10,000 feet down, it starts to crack, starts to break out, and the oil starts to form. So it's known as cracking. So here's the oil window. We all worry about as geologists. You don't drill wells up here that didn't get buried deep enough. There's some places in Australia they drilled into, they only had 2,000 feet of sediment. There's no oil. It didn't get heated enough by the Earth's internal heat to generate the oil. And so they walked away from there. They got to find areas where it's buried deep enough, between about 5 to 15,000 feet or so. That's the oil window. You get down here too far, even the oil disappears and becomes just natural gas because it overcooks. So it's kind of this window that geologists look for, like I used to look for, in that one window. But offshore, that temperature, everything shifts down a little bit. You can drill down 20,000 feet, still hit oil offshore. The rocks are a little different. But here's what you can do in the laboratories. This was done in a laboratory in Washington. You can make oil in under 60 minutes. From marine algae to oil in under 60 minutes. Under 60 minutes, under the right conditions. The oil can form very quickly. And I think it formed within about 200 years after the flood. You already have oil seeps coming up. Because at the Tower of Babel, they were using oil in their mortar to make a really strong mortar. And there's still some buildings in the Middle East today where they can see oil in the mortar. And that mortar is still there. It's very, very durable by mixing oil in with it. So that's when you started getting oils after the flood at the Tower of Babel. So the Bible says about oil, it says, then they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They had brick for stone and they had asphalt for mortar. And that's when you first see the real oil, was at the Tower of Babel. Okay, here's the Middle East today. These bright green dots are oils. The seeps are the dark green. So there's still a lot of dark green all over the place. Still a lot of oil seeps coming up in the Middle East. Where the Tower of Babel was built somewhere over here. Nobody knows exactly where. People argue, it's over here, it's over here. But it's somewhere in this picture, I think. There's lots of oil coming up. There's lots of oil still there. I tell you, oil seeps are coming up as well. Here's an oil seep in the Middle East right here. They leak out of the oil deposits. They seep out. They find fractures, and they don't sit there for 150 million years because they leak away for one thing, and they decay away. So the truth about oil formation is oil can form very quickly. I think it formed within 100 to 300 years after the flood. In the time of Tower of Babel, within a few hundred years after the flood for sure. And again, not only is it not bad for the environment, but oil can form very, very quickly, not slowly. And this is the big thing here. Oil can survive for millions of years, as they told me. Let's look at that a bit. Again, oil is like the soft tissue we talked about. It's organic. It's a naturally occurring organic compound made up of carbon and hydrogen atoms strung together in these big, long carbon compounds, which is why it's difficult for life to come from non-life, because they're trying to take inorganic chemistry and make it organic. It's a completely different change, inorganic chemistry of what minerals and rocks are made out of. To turn that into a living organism, you need these organic compounds. And that's why we know that oil is from organic compounds. It's made of organic material. And that's why it burns and produces CO2 and water. But here's some of the benzene rings and that make up the oils and different paraffins and naphthalenes and different things like that. I used to study this at Western Michigan for one semester. I'm like, whew. I got 99% of it now. You don't use it, you lose it. You guys know that one? No? You guys remember your organic chemistry? Any organic chemists in here? I used to know. But anyway, in general, here's what oil and gas geologists try to explain why they can have old oil. They think it got pasteurized. They think the Earth pasteurized the oil at 80 degrees Celsius. So I looked up what do they believe. They assume pasteurization temperature is approximately 80 degrees. It's from the Oil and Gas American Association of Petroleum Geologists. So you dig through the literature, and all you can find about how oil can survive for millions of years in their mind, say they think it got magically pasteurized, but they don't say magically. And it stayed that way, but that's not the case. Oil will not just stay there and sit there. There's a general view today among petroleum geoscientists, because this is what they're told, that biodegradation in reservoirs ceases at 75 to 80 degrees Celsius in the zone of thermophilic organisms. This is 2001. But you go to Yellowstone, in places where you have water that's that hot or hotter, and there's still algae living in it and bacteria living here making these colors. The different bacteria gives you the different color bands you see at Yellowstone. So they are living in that hot water. There's bacteria everywhere. As deep as we've drilled in oil wells, there is bacteria. And bacteria causes biodegradation. Even anaerobic bacteria eats oil. And so oil can't sit around. There's always groundwater flow. I studied groundwater flow at Western Michigan. Because groundwater moves 50 feet per year on the average. Sometimes faster, sometimes slower. It's moving about 50 feet per year. So any pollution near you is coming towards your land. It's going to get there eventually. You should always test your wells. Pat, do you test your wells we're drinking out of?
We do.
Okay, good. See, that's how you're going to do. You never know who leaks something, half a mile away. They start getting there. Thermophilic bacteria, but even that breaks down because there's bacteria in the ground that God put in there to eat that stuff up. So even the worst oil spills and the worst contamination spills do start to clean up because of bacteria that eats it. So the details and rates of the processes involved, the oil and gas guys say they go on degradation, are still poorly understood. But the central role of bacteria in subsurface petroleum degradation is accepted. So they accept that there's biodegradation going on. They think it can just be magically pasteurized and just sit there, but there's groundwater flow all the time. So warm water comes in, eats these things just like at the surface. When you spill oil at the surface, like the BP spill across the previously Gulf of Mexico, because it was back then, it spilled all this oil, remember all that? What happened to most of it? We wrote about this in our Liberty textbook. 25% of it decayed away from the sun, beating at it, breaking it down. Another 25% was eaten by bacteria, and some of it sank to the bottom as really thick tar, which will eventually break down as well. But most of it started to biodegrade naturally by the bacteria in the water. Underground, the bacteria is not as plentiful, but it's still there. And so slowly oil will decay away. Just how much biodegradation? It says as much as 70% of the original oil volume is lost to biodegradation. So they admit this. Oil is decaying away, so how can it be billions of years old if it's biodegrading so quickly? Difference in the degree of biodegradation are observed. Difference is thought to reflect the effects of timing, but really it's the effects of groundwater flow. So even though you have oil reservoirs sitting there, the oil got there by groundwater flow. Oil rides on the back of water. It gets trapped because it's lighter than water in maybe an upside down bowl shape. It's trapped, and some of it seeks to the surface. A lot of it gets trapped in there, but you're bringing in new water all the time with new bacteria. So even if it were pasteurized temporarily, it's going to eventually bring in new bacteria all the time. No petroleum geologist studies groundwater flow enough. I didn't study it until I went back to school. Then you start understanding fluid flow. Everything's moving around underground. Nothing stays stagnant. There's no closed off system. That's one of the problems with dating things with uranium, is that uranium is moving back and forth and all around. Uranium is very soluble. It ends up in a lot of dinosaur bones, and the big holes in the dinosaur bones they're full of uranium. So how do you date things with uranium when it's moving around? They just have to assume things, and then it didn't move here. But they're just saying that to get the numbers they want. So here, they're admitting that there's all this biodegradation taking place. And that most of the world's oil, here's what happens, it eats off the tops of these things. In just 71 days, this oil becomes just tar. Here's some pictures of it. This is just in 7 days. Goes from thick oil to this dried up stuff and breaks down very quickly from bacterial action. So it's quicker at the surface because you have a lot more, but underground they're still eating away. Here's 70% of oil is biodegraded. A lot of it becomes these oil sands, the tar sands you hear about in Alberta. That's really highly biodegraded oil. Get heavy oil in Wyoming, really extra heavy oil. It's supposed to be 150 million years old, but it's just really biodegraded heavy oil. Most oil, the best oil we see like West Texas Intermediate, that's only 30% of the world's oil supply. Most of it's very thick because it's biodegraded. So it's biodegrading. If we don't get it out, it's just going to continue to biodegrade. So oil is not pasteurized. Oil is an organic compound. It degrades quickly, even underground. To me, it's amazing there's still oil there from 4,500 years ago to today, but it's still forming. I think a lot of oil is still forming today. Many oil fields produce a lot more oil than they're supposed to in terms of the volume that they estimate. Some wells in the Williston Basin produce over 1 million barrels out of one well. They're like, where'd the oil come from? They don't know. It just keeps slowly producing more and more. So some of these oils are still being produced. There are people that have done studies with carbon-14 dating. They find carbon-14 in oil, showing they're not millions of years old, or there'd be no carbon-14. They find carbon-14 in diamonds even. Sent 20-some diamonds off to laboratories, and they found carbon-14 in every one of them that was measurable. So how can they be billions of years old and you're finding carbon-14 still that decays away in thousands of years? No carbon-14, you can't measure anything beyond 80 or 100,000 years at the most. They find them in dinosaur bones, carbon-14 measurable. They just say, oh, that's all contamination. How do you contaminate a diamond? It's pretty hard. But oil cannot survive for millions of years because it biodegrades like everything else. That's why we see so much biodegraded oil. Almost all the oil we produce is partially biodegraded. Finally, oil existed before the flood. This is a big complaint that some of the old Earth geologists do. My buddy, I don't really know him very well, but I read a lot of his work. David Montgomery, out from, I think, Washington or Washington State, wrote a book in 2012, The Rocks Don't Lie. But he forgot to say people do, because he's lying. He purposely says this, a literal reading of the Bible declares that such sedimentary rocks already exist at the time of the flood because bitumen, the pitch or tar Noah used to caulk the ark, comes from sedimentary rock. But he purposely didn't look up the Hebrew word that the Bible translates in the King James as pitch. And it really is, the Bible says this, if you read through, pitch is the English translation of the Hebrew word kofir. Is that how you say that, Pat? Kofir? Kofir, sheathed or covered the ark. We don't know what the material was, but every other time kofir is used, it refers to some sort of expensive covering or even money. The other 16 times it's used in the Old Testament is not translated as pitch. So unfortunately, it's kind of a bad translation in that one spot in the King James. Dare I say it? But the original Hebrew tells us it's not oil. It's some sort of a covering that covered the ark, not oil. So oil was not used on the ark. Pitch was not a hydrocarbon. Kofir was some sort of expensive covering. And in some ways, it's almost like Jesus. His blood covers our sins. Well, they had this expensive covering all around the ark to protect the people inside. It's like, like they sprinkle blood to cover the sins of the Israelites before Jesus. It's the same sort of thing here. Until Jesus came and fulfilled the law, we had to do this covering. The Jewish people had to do this covering for the sins by shedding the blood of animals. So this was almost like a covering they had to put on the animal. It might have been a tree resin they cooked up or something like that. They did find out, interestingly enough, not in my talk, but I'm going to put this in here because we're almost done. About a year and a half ago, I wrote an article about Neanderthal, how they were distilling tree resin underground, making a really good tar to glue their stone tools onto their wooden sticks. They were distilling the stuff underground. And the evolutionary scientists think that Neanderthals were dumber than sticks, couldn't even speak, but they find more and more that they're just fully humans. Most of us have Neanderthal DNA in our DNA because we're just fully human. They're just different humans that went north, kind of bred amongst themselves for a while after the Tower of Babel. They're just as human as you and me. And so they knew some of this technology. Maybe the technology of distilling this tar underground was what they did on the ark, to make this tree resin to seal the ark with, because they didn't have oil. And so it's amazing how this covering could have been produced by just plant resin that they cooked and underground distilled. So 4 fables of oil. Oil is, of course, is not necessarily bad for the environment, even though overuse of anything can be bad. If we rely on one energy source for everything, that's always going to be a problem. But unfortunately, that's our best resource right now. Oil does form rapidly. Under the right conditions, it can form very, very quickly, even naturally within a couple hundred years. We have some evidence of that in the Bible, that oil was already seeping out of the ground. Depends on how old Peleg was, right? 100 to 300 years or so up to the flood, something in that range. And then third, oil cannot survive for millions of years because it's organic. And there's enough bacteria underground, it'll eat it up slowly. So you can't find oil in Wyoming that's 150 million years old, because they'd be gone. And fourth, no oil existed before the flood. Real oil was only a product of the flood, burying marine algae and marine plankton very, very quickly, so it didn't have time to decay. And then that was get buried down. Once it got buried deep enough, down to 5,000 to 10,000 feet down, the Earth's heat cooks it out and produces these droplets of oil, which then get moved by water into these traps that we used to look for to find oil. And the bottom line is there was a worldwide flood, and the oil is evidence of that. You wouldn't have oil because you wouldn't have organic debris buried quick enough to make oil if you didn't have a flood. And for those of you that are skeptics out there, which I know there's a few, and that's okay, you should question everything, even mine. This is back in 1978. We found that the volume of biomass in ocean sediments today, just one day, is equivalent to this, 2 to the 10th, 22nd power grams of carbon. Just a few percent of which provides enough organic material for all the oil ever found. And that holds through today. Might be another percent used up by today. So that's one day's biomass out there in the oceans. Can produce all the oil, just a small percentage of all the oil ever found. And so there's enough to cover. This is just a few percent of that. Did I say that wrong? Yeah. Anyway, there's a lot of oil that can be produced. In a year-long flood, you're going to have a tremendous amount of opportunity to bury a lot of organic debris, not just one day. So a tremendous amount of oil can be consumed. So people are like, well, how do you do all that in 1 year? You can do it in 1 day. You don't need a year. And even that explains all the oil ever found. So this is a beautiful picture in Texas. You gotta love it. Michigan, you guys produce a lot of oil too. Don't deny it. Don't deny your sins. According to the evolution, no. According to some of the liberals out there, they're like, oh, you shouldn't produce any oil. We should just stop producing it. But then they don't realize what they're saying. They don't understand that oil is what makes the world run. Oil makes our planet. I think over 50% of the oil that's produced is made into plastics. It's not even used for energy. So it's, when you put plastic wraps around these, look, see this? Plastic. It's all oil. Yeah.
Clothes too.
Yes. I thought there was some books. Did we have some books in here? Yeah. They explain that in here. In this book, there's a whole chapter on oil and coal, which you might find interesting. It goes into the details of what I talked about in some ways. I also talk about how in an earlier chapter in sedimentary rocks, I talk about shale is deposited by moving water. Limestone deposited by moving water. Just like those flumes I showed earlier. It doesn't slowly settle out like we see today. These big, thick shale deposits didn't take millions of years to be deposited. They can be deposited quickly. So, yeah, we'll go through that again. These are gone, but there's a little article in there on the flood. But I don't think this one is oil. But you can get it online. And then again, if you haven't done, I've been telling you this is free. A lot of you have signed up, so thanks for signing up. We'll take you back and put you in the system when I get back next week to ICR. And then if you don't want to wait, you can sign up online. You can go to icr.org and sign up online. All right, well, that's all I'm going to say. 5 talks is enough. I can't stand listening to myself anymore. So we do some Q&A though, right? Q&A time?
You can break and then come back.
Okay, if anybody wants to come back and grill the geologist, he's skeptical. It's okay. You should question everything I tell you. Right? All right, well, you guys are excused. Pat will double pound you the certificate of completion. They survived the 5-lecture seminar, and therefore they should get like so many, what are those called? Yeah, no, there's CPU, what are those called? So, yeah, so anyway, thank you. I better run these back in case there's a rush on the books. There's a run on the books.
So be back
I'll be back in 5.
10, 15 minutes.
Okay.
Continuing education units.
Yeah, that's it. CEUs. My daughter, Katie Rose, has just said, last call for books. They're going to pack them up. So if anybody is desperate to buy one of Timothy's books, run now. Or forever hold your peace. Just kidding. And anybody that has food donated here, you brought, if it's cold, it's in the fridge. Please grab it afterwards. Or if it's not cold, you can just get your dish and all that, or take it with you, please. My wife says so. Just a couple of housekeeping announcements, as we say. There we go. Okay. All right. I might have been on there. Gotta shut that out. Trying to get the show on the road. Trying to get the show on the road. Yeah.
This is where Tim
Carved in
comes up
stone.
here. I want you to notice, I guess you probably read it for yourself, but all the sessions, all Tim's sessions will be on YouTube.
That's
And,
scary.
thanks, Larry. They're available on YouTube. We streamed them all live. You can look them up
told
under
me
Country
that.
Kitchen Evangelical Preachers by the date and all that. So just want to make sure everybody knows that. If you want to rewatch something, you want to go back and what did he say about that? You can look it up that way. Tim, please come and
You didn't tell me that. I was picking on the Texans. I'll be in trouble now.
pick on. Yeah, I know you might be in trouble.
Yeah, they deserve it.
Everything's
They deserve
recorded,
it.
Timothy.
They brag so. Dr. Galuza picks on them all the time, relentlessly, because there's no person more proud of their state than a Texan,
That's true.
and there's nothing there but oil. Oil is what made Texas what it is. Without oil, it'd just be ranch land.
And scorpions and anyway. All right,
A
Timothy.
lot of things trying to kill you. Fire ants too.
Tim's going to take your
All right,
questions.
I'll
Q&A.
try to answer your questions. Patrick, you don't have a microphone to hand them, like Phil Donahue? Yeah, you got to stand up and holler really loud so everybody can hear you, because you're being recorded. It's gonna. Well, they might need one. No, just ask. It's fine. Come up closer and you can ask. I'm going to hide down here in case you start throwing stuff. There's closet Texans in here. Yeah, all right. I think David could have done a blind against Goliath. There you go.
Let's pick up stones, Timothy.
Yeah. I would appreciate it.
Okay, I guess I'll be the official holder of the mic. As soon as he gets us on here. Anybody have questions? Over here? Randy, is it?
That's like so Donahue.
Thank you. Are the Tigris and Euphrates rivers today in the same ancient riverbeds as in Genesis 2?
Not at all, because they're built on top of thousands of feet of flood rocks. Most of that whole Middle East area, Iraq and everything, is built on early flood sediments. Thousands of feet thick, even up to the receding phase. You have rocks that are salt deposits. You've got sands and shales. And so those are just names, just like when people came from England, they called this New York versus York. And so they're just using the same names. Unfortunately, people try to think this is where the Garden of Eden was, but that whole area was flooded early, just like Michigan. It was part of the earliest part of the flood. I think it was a shallow sea at the time. I think the Garden of Eden might have been in Antarctica, for all I know, or it might have been in Canada. Somewhere we had higher ground where you didn't have a lot of sediment being deposited until late. So I assume it was somewhere up high. But it wasn't, there's nothing special about the Holy Land in the pre-flood world. That area seemed to be a shallow sea where you deposited a lot of sediments. Early, a lot of marine fossils early. So those names are used because they remembered those names from the pre-flood. There's the rivers remind them maybe of the rivers, they named them those same rivers. Right. Well, probably not, because Utah flooded early too, much of it. So. But there's areas where I can identify based on the flooding progression. You can see the areas that were dry throughout most of the flood till that last sequence. And so Minnesota, maybe they're in Minnesota. Somewhere up high. Or you can howl really loud.
Can you speak to why or why not the canopy model of the flood has, I think, fallen out of favor? And did that, it's kind of a two-part question. Did that also contribute to how long people, if there was a canopy, did that contribute to how long people lived beforehand or how big animals got and so forth? But Specifically, what's the deal with the canopy theory?
Well, it's fallen a little bit by the wayside. Larry Vardaman, who worked for ICR for many years, did a lot of modeling and studies. Other people did studies. They were trying to explain the 40 days of rain from this canopy of water that might have collapsed. And they really said that it's not enough. You can't put enough water up there to explain all that. So it's kind of fallen out of favor with a lot of the scientists. I don't know if there was some sort of canopy up there or not. I don't know if you needed that to sustain life. I think God made, everything to live forever. So everything was perfect until Adam and Eve sinned, and then you started decaying. And so early on, there was very few mutations in the human genome. It took a few generations. Every generation we pass on more mutations to the next generation and more mutations to the next generation. So eventually we will mutate ourselves out of existence. That's the way sin works. And so, but Jesus will come before that, obviously. But if you go back and look at the mutation rate on humans, it goes back 6,000 years. You go back and look at rabbits, it goes back 6,000 years. That's as far back as we can push it. And so that's what explains all the mutations we have. But the mutations are pretty much bad, and we pass on bad mutations. And that mutation rate, I think, reached a critical mass, so to speak, after the flood. And so the genome that caused us to age, or whatever the parts of our genetics that caused us to age, accelerated. Whether God stepped in there or not, but nonetheless, there's a point where I think it wasn't the atmosphere that's protecting us and keeping us from aging. It was just we were closer to perfection. And the mutations hadn't built up enough. And there was a point where we reached a point where God said, you're going to live 80 years. Even though Moses lived a little more, because that was supernatural. But he limited that. You can see the drop-off right after the flood. And a lot of that, I think, the geneticists now think that's genetic mutations, harmful mutations that got into our human genome. Well, I think the fountains of the deep are producing some water, obviously, because even today, volcanoes produce a lot of water and CO2. So there's a lot of water trapped in the mantle. People have studied how much water is down there. It's not just sloshing around, though. It's kind of in the rocks as OH. But when it comes to the surface, it produces a lot of water. And so there might have been a lot of water coming out of these initial bursts that God cracked over the earth. However, it cracked open. I believe it was a miracle. That people try to say there might have been an asteroid. I think just a miracle to me is sufficient. But you crack these, those cracks. Obviously, lava was coming out. We can still see the lava because we can't see the water. So I don't know how much water came out of the earth. I think a lot of it you can explain just by raising the sea level up, by pushing the bottom of the ocean up, and making a new ocean crust push the water up sufficiently to flood the whole earth.
Okay.
But there is some water from the fountains as well. I don't know how much. How do you sort that out? But you can see there's lots of lava on the east coast of the U.S. There's lava on the west coast. There's lava across northernmost Canada. It poured out just before you started bringing flood sediments in. There was a tremendous amount of fracturing and lava that poured out. And with that was probably a lot of water. But exactly where that water went, people do fountains shooting up in the air, coming down. I don't know. How do you scientifically test that? So you have to do some models. Engineers can maybe model some of that. But the canopy theory is fallen out of favor with a lot of scientists. I don't know if that's good or bad. I don't think you really necessarily need it to make animals live long. That's the short answer. I know you're not happy about that. Neither was John Morris. John Morris, to the day he died, was like, I like the canopy theory. Why are people, throwing that out? And I'm like, yeah, I know. I don't know. I don't have a good answer because I'm not the one that did the math and tried to calculate what it could do. But it's kind of fallen out of favor.
With the Grand Canyon, how was it formed so deep, and there's not other Grand Canyons in the world, or are there?
Well, there are some big canyons in the world. They're comparable in size or comparable in length, but there's only one that's exposed so well. There's some in Antarctica they can see under the ice. There's some in Greenland under the ice. There's others in China and places in Asia that are pretty big and impressive. But this one's so accessible that people call this one of the wonders of the world. So a lot of it's because that land was actually rising 5,000 feet. At the same time, the water was draining off the earth. So the timing of things was just right, that you had 5,000 feet of uplift with cracks, and the water found those cracks and just dug down. So it's the timing of the uplift in the area. The whole Four Corners region rose about, it's called the Colorado Plateau, that rose about 5,000 feet up.
During the flood.
Yeah, during the flood, as the waters were receding. And so that's when all the mountains popped up too. Most of the world's mountains all popped up at the same time. Tens of thousands of feet of movement was going on, while Noah and the animals were still in the ark. They were on the other side of the world. But it's a tremendous amount of movement that would cause just earthquakes beyond measure today. 10s and 11s on the Richter scale to move that much earth up and down. So a tremendous amount. But hopefully I answered that a little bit. You had to have the right timing, 5,000 feet of uplift, so you could get 5,000 feet of cutting down, essentially. And very few places have that.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and God spoke, and it came into being. Do you find the Big Bang Theory consistent with that? Do you hold anything with the Big Bang Theory, or do you completely disregard it?
I pretty much disregard it. I don't think it's, there's articles in that Creation Basics and Beyond by my physics colleague. He's discussed all the evidence for the Big Bang Theory, how a lot of it is contrary to what they predicted, and they have to keep changing it, keep changing it, keep changing it. There's really not a lot of evidence for the Big Bang. They only do that because they basically rewound the VHS tape. And so they claim that they can see evidence that the universe is expanding, and there's even some debate about that now, whether it's really expanding or not. And so they said if we rewind the tape, of course, if it's expanding, it's going to come back to one point. That's kind of the general idea behind it, but it may not be expanding like they're saying. There's even debate on that. So there's some articles about the Big Bang and a lot of evidence for a young universe in our literature. You can do a search online as well. A lot of the stuff is free online too. You can search our website, which isn't the best search engine, but it'll find a lot of articles on different topics like that if you want to know.
You just said that for the young Earth. How does the Big Bang not go along with the young Earth?
Well, what does the Big Bang say? It says that everything formed, the Earth formed basically it says the stars and galaxies would have formed before the Earth, and God talks about He formed the Earth first. He didn't make the stars until day 4 of creation week. He made the sun and moon day 4 of the creation week. So it's a little bit about an order for one thing. And, some people argue that God could have used that, could have done all these things, but that's not what He said He did. And I made all the stars too, He says. He just kind of throws that in there. Like there's billions and billions of stars. The galaxies that are winding up, we see all these galaxies, they wind up way too fast to still show arms. These galaxies will wind up in about 250 million years. They can't be billions of years old. You wouldn't see any arms on the galaxies. They're winding too fast. And comets are coming in, they disappear within a million years. But they have to keep saying, well, there's an Oort cloud out there which we've never actually physically identified that's making comets, because they have to explain these youthful comets all the time that are coming in. There's a lot of things in the universe that tell us, even the blue stars are burning up their hydrogen too fast, and they can't last millions of years. And yet a lot of the stars are blue stars. And so there's all this evidence out there that the universe is young. And the Big Bang Theory doesn't really work because you got to make everything out of gravity. You got to get things spinning around. You got to get these clouds of dusty material, this clumpy material, which they haven't found as background is not clumpy. The background, universe is pretty uniform, so you don't have these clumps like you would predict in the Big Bang Theory to make these different stars ultimately, and then the planets or the planetesimals to go around the stars. And so God made all these wonders and amazing galaxies. He made all this amazing planets, even around a lot of these stars for us to see. But I don't believe there's any life on any of these other planets, even though they try to claim there is. Just because you have water, if you can find water on these planets, doesn't mean you're going to get life, because we can't make life out of water here. They're still trying to figure out how to make life. And I think only God can breathe life into anything. Only God can create life. But the Big Bang Theory, a lot of what they say conflicts with what the Bible says in terms of the timing of things, but also the whole idea of how it forms itself. God made it too quickly for that to actually happen. I hope that helped. Go ahead.
I just wanted to ask a couple questions. So I'm a farmer, We farm up there in Hastings. And it's weird because we've got 80 acres that we farm through, plow the sod. My wife and I pick rocks. You'll find metamorphic, sedimentary, and sometimes igneous rocks in the same field within a couple hundred feet of each other. And you're pulling big monsters out of the ground. Some of them are pudding stones.
Yeah.
Some aren't.
my
Some
wife likes
fossils. It's amazing just that they're all clumped together. It's like, how would that mess be in flat fields?
Well, you're bringing it in from the glaciers. Again, so you have all this glacial drift, they call it, glacial debris. And so all those rocks are from Canada, northern Michigan. The fossil-rich ones are probably from up by Petoskey in those areas. So the glaciers came across and picked up all this rock material and just carried it along for hundreds of miles in some cases. We find copper down in Indiana from the copper mine areas up in the Upper Peninsula. And so all these glaciers, as far as they went, they dragged all this material with them. And just when they melted, they just dropped it. So those would be those glacial erratics.
Okay, I got you. Because see, my wife's theory is they grow. You know, we water the ground, they just pop up out of the ground in the fall.
Well, they do. We had to pick up rocks in our field too all the time. So that's the one. Pat and I used to go through those rock piles and look for fossils in them, in the corners of all the fields where I grew up as well. So they do kind of keep popping up because they freeze-thaw cycles kind of moves them upward. That's a good question. That goes back to the glacial story. You know, you have to move all these rocks down here that's evidence that the glaciers did come through here, bringing all these rocks that aren't below your feet, but yet there they all are. There, if you can go to Canada, you can find the pudding stones where the source rocks are from. But I need to go there. My wife loves pudding stones. You know what I'm talking about? Those white quartzites with the little red pieces of jasper in them?
Yep.
Kind of cool.
Me and my sister each have a question. I'll go first. Do scientists have an answer besides creation to how energy got here, since energy cannot be created or destroyed?
No, they have no idea. All scientists know is how it works. You know, they can tell you that you can't create energy. That's part of the laws of thermodynamics, that you can't create or destroy energy. That's why you never can reach absolute zero, which is the third law, because to do that, you'd have to stop the atoms from moving and the electrons going around them or however they work. We don't know a lot. There's a strong nuclear force that holds together the protons, however that works in an atom. And nobody can explain that. To me, that's God right there. God says he's holding together everything together. He's holding together the atoms. Without God, I think these things would just blow up. Because you got the same plus and plus. Two pluses don't like to be next to each other. So they said if you get them close enough, it's this mysterious, strong nuclear force that holds them together. They get separated a little bit, then they shoot apart. But how do you hold something together that wants to repel from each other without some sort of miraculous hand of God? To me, that's that hand of God right there. They can't explain the strong nuclear force. Nor can they explain where anything bigger than iron comes from in stars. Stars can only fuse together atoms up to the size of iron. And all the bigger elements, you have, where did those come from? Why do we have uranium? Why do we have all these heavy elements? Stars can't make them because there's the point where it has to go uphill. There's more energy required to make them. And so that's a big problem in physics and in stellar research as well. And how do they explain that? Well, nebular, they explode. You know, they say when these stars explode, they miraculously make all these things. So they're just making up stories to explain what they can't explain. But there's a lot of mysteries out there just in like chemistry and physics that they just have to ignore and make up stories to explain away. And we let them get away with it. Unfortunately, when you call them out, though, they do ignore you.
So what else could you use for a substitute for oil? And is there any oil underwater, or is it just in the rocks?
Well, it's underwater in the rocks. It's seeping up to the surface. That's why in the Gulf of America, they're drilling a lot of oil. I used to look for oil in the Gulf of America, but it was the Gulf of Mexico back in those days, way back when. Yeah, but there's a lot of oil all over offshore. That's why I got a lot of data offshore off many of these continents from my database, because they're drilling so far offshore now, much further, and they're finding huge oil deposits out there. So those were sediments deposited in the flood. A lot of it was that washed off the continents as the water receded. In the Gulf, for example, tremendous amount of organic debris was deposited in there as well, and buried deep enough that it cooked into oil. There was another part to your question I don't think I answered. What was the other part?
It was, what else could you use for a substitute for oil
Well,
in the future?
that's the million-dollar question. I've read some articles where you can make small nuclear power plants all over, like they use for the submarines, and produce oil for like whole, cities with small nuclear power plants. They wouldn't have enough nuclear, to cause an explosion, get into the hazardous part of nuclear power. But you can use more nuclear power, but you don't build them near you where you have big earthquakes, like in Japan. There's always going to be a bigger earthquake, just like there'll be a bigger hurricane to hit New Orleans. You can build a big levee, but there's going to be a bigger hurricane coming in. And unfortunately, we build things in poor locations because we don't think about the long term. And most of our cities, even Kalamazoo, built on a river, because the river was the highway. So everything's built on rivers, and of course rivers flood. Every 40, 50 years they'll flood, maybe every 100 years they'll flood. And unfortunately, some of these flash floods like we just saw in Texas are really dangerous because you get a lot of rain in a very small area, and it all goes down one river, and you get a tremendous amount of flow very quickly. It dissipates quickly, but it's lethal. It kills, up to 200 or so people, it sounds like. That's a small disaster compared to some. But they try to blame it on climate change again, but those always happen. We just have more people living in areas where they probably shouldn't be living, and so we're putting people in locations that cause more climate issues, I think. But they've gone back. I didn't show this graph. They showed the amount of deaths due to natural disasters has actually been dropping in the last 100 years because we are getting smarter about where we live. Or getting more warning. Even though disasters still happen, unfortunately, and people do die. But there's no big increase in the natural disaster deaths in the last 100 years.
Thank you. So, how did the guy squish the dead dolphin?
You'd have to read the paper, but the dolphin was already dead, and he bought a piece of the dolphin, and I think he put it in like a big vise, with sand, and squished it down, and did the best he could. And he waited a while, I forget how long, weeks, and then he pulled it apart and looked, and there were all these little fibers coming out the side from the skin of the dolphin. It was decaying a little bit. I have to go back and look at his paper. He describes his methods. So when you do science, you describe the methods you do as well. But I have to go back and double check. That's a good question. I don't have the answer to.
I think a lot of us wondered about that.
Thank you.
Well, you can squish things pretty good and set them.
It was already dead.
Yeah, it was already dead. He didn't get a live dolphin and go through and kill a dolphin. And somebody had already trapped, pulled it in. I don't know what they do or found it. I don't know where he got his dolphin. I don't think he says that in his paper. Hopefully, is it illegal to kill a dolphin?
I don't know.
If you're nodding, yes, it is. I don't know. Are they protected, like manatees or anything? I don't know. Anyway, somebody fished it out of the ocean apparently and got a piece of it and squished it.
I had a question about Yellowstone.
Oh, in the back.
Yeah, in the back. Had a question about Yellowstone. You said you didn't think you would see it explode, and yet we've got, seismic activity across the U.S. There's different plates and shifts, and so what do you see as the next big event from just some of your studies around the world?
Well, you're going to get a big, I think, there's always going to be a few big earthquakes, but they're not as many or as frequent as we had during the flood year, obviously, when you had hundreds of these probably generated a day from the rapid plate movement. Today, we still have a little bit of movement, a little residual movement of the plates. And so you still have this much movement going on. These 60-mile thick plates are hard to stop. And then 4,500 years ago, they're moving really fast, and then they just kind of came to a screeching halt because all the original ocean crust was consumed, and now you have all hot crust, and the hot crust didn't want to sink. And so everything kind of stopped. And so God had a natural braking system into moving the plates as well. But they're still moving a little bit, and you still get some movement and buildup of energy, and then they just go suddenly, and that's what generates these earthquakes. So you're always going to get some earthquakes in the same areas we get them now, or along these plate boundaries particularly. There's even some like in New Madrid, Missouri that happened in 1811, 1812, nowhere near a plate boundary. And so they think that might be from the subducted plate underneath kind of bumping up against the bottom of the plate And nobody really knows how to explain some of that. But there's some earthquakes that happen in places that we don't expect. But they have seismic activity there all the time. They're so small you don't really notice. They're very small earthquakes. They're not, you don't feel them, but they pick them up on the seismographs. So there's a lot of earthquake-prone areas. Even in Michigan, there's a few earthquakes that happened. They was telling me about the one in Scotts in 2015. And so, we get them in Texas. She thought I had restless leg syndrome one morning. And it was an earthquake in Oklahoma from putting in too much fracking fluid down to a well, and it caused an earthquake about a 4 on the Richter scale, and we felt it in Dallas. We're on its second story, so our second story shook a little more. But it was pretty interesting. So, first earthquakes we ever felt was down in Texas from too many fluids going down a disposal well. I don't think Yellowstone's going to erupt. I think that was a flood phenomenon. So it produced tens of thousands of feet of volcanic debris all around Yellowstone and Cody and these mountains. And then even some of that eroded away as the floodwaters receded, cut these canyons you can see that you drive through from Cody to Yellowstone, right between thousands of feet of volcanics on all sides. It makes some amazing structures. Devil's Tower would have been part of the receding phase of the flood too. You had intrusions of magma coming up. There's even a couple more of those to the north, but they're not exposed very well. There's 3 more little clumps that stick up. But there's magmas that came in at about the same time all over. So that's some of the late flood activity from all the turmoil happening in the mantle. I think you had a lot of things going on. But most of that has subsided now. Even that was exposed by the final receding phase of the flood. It left just that little remnant sticking up. So we have an article about that on our website, so you can look up Devil's Tower and see what we think. So it's pretty fascinating. A lot of this stuff happened during the flood. I don't think, we're not going to have the big super volcano eruption at Yellowstone anymore, I don't believe. Maybe a little poof.
Maybe the end times or something.
Yeah, maybe. Well, God says there'll be more, right? More earthquakes.
What do you think of the recent activity in the Mount Rainier area with the seismic?
Oh, somebody told me about that. I don't know anything about it. I was here. I don't know. Somebody wrote me last night and said, "Do you think it's going to erupt?" I'm like, it could. Mount St. Helens did. You never know. People think because it hasn't erupted in their lifetime, it's not going to erupt. But, these things will periodically erupt, maybe. And it might be 300 years. Could be next week. Generally, volcanoes give you some warning. And Mount St. Helens had months of warning. We just didn't know when it was going to erupt, what day. But there was a lot of rumbling and smoke and stuff for months. Even Mount Vesuvius, they had years of warning, puffing and blowing smoke. And finally it blew, and then people still didn't all leave. A lot of people left, others stuck around, and then they got inundated by these pyroclastic flows that come shooting out of those volcanoes. That's the danger of those explosive volcanoes, is they're very deadly. The ones from the subduction zones, they make the right aerosols for the ice age, but when they erupt, they have a potential to kill thousands of people because they're so devastating. Those pyroclastic flows come at you at hurricane speeds with molten glass basically flying at you at 1,000 degrees Celsius. And you don't have a chance. It just knocks them right over. There were Roman soldiers laying on the beach knocked over flat, and their skulls burst because their brains boiled. Popped their skulls. And so it was pretty amazing amount of temperature.
Just had a question about the Scotts area here. About 10 years ago, they discovered oil, and they started drilling for oil in this area. Most of those wells are like 5,000 feet deep, 4,500 feet deep. So am I understanding correctly then that the oil is the organic matter from the flood, and we have a mile of overburden left behind? Is that?
Well, there's more flood sediments above it. You got to get the right reservoir that's permeable enough to produce out of, unless they're fracking them all. But they got to be very deep enough. The oil might have been generated deeper, and as it rose towards the surface because it's lighter than water. So oil has a tendency to try to get to the surface as it moves in groundwater. So it might have been generated at 10,000 feet down and just trapped at 5,000 feet because you had the right trapping layer above it, for example, that's low permeability, and then you have a good permeable layer right there to serve as your reservoir for the oil. So you have to have the right conditions, the right time. But it is you're producing oil from the flood, from the organic debris from the flood. How long that oil's been there, maybe it's just 500 years or 1,000 years, I don't know. But I don't know, is it pretty good oil? Is it?
Well, they talked about some of the first wells they drilled, they called green oil, and they were really happy about that.
That sounds pretty good. Yeah, that's good. That's good liquid. It's low gravity stuff or high gravity stuff. You want the West Texas Intermediate. You don't want the really thick stuff because that's been heavily biodegraded, like in Wyoming. Because you get more money for it. So if it's not so thick, they got to mix that thick stuff with thinner stuff to make it workable. The tar sands they got to cook. It costs a lot of energy to produce that oil because you got to heat it all up to get the good stuff out of it. And so if you want green oil, that's pretty good. It's probably pretty young too. But they'll never admit that.
So were you saying, to clarify, all the oil, it was just created during the flood, or is there some being created now? Or is this oil you're saying that is like the scats may have just come up?
Well, there's oil that was all the organic debris was buried in the flood. And it gets in the right window, it'll cook it out. And so some of this might have been cooking out for thousands of years. You're just getting some that's been produced the last 500 years maybe. Some of the other stuff's being biodegraded away. And so exactly how old the oil is, it's hard to tell. But all the organic debris came from the flood, I believe. It's the original source. And then how much is being generated, that can be continuing even today. But it's droplet by droplet. So you're not going to fill up, if you drain an oil field, you're not going to fill it up overnight. It's going to take hundreds of years to fill back up maybe. Because you got a little drop at a time. And nobody really studies that in oil and gas. One of the mysteries of oil and gas is they don't know how it goes from the source rock to the trap. They can fingerprint it and see where it came from, but they don't know how it got there. But it has to go along by groundwater flow. And so but nobody can study that underground. They can study in laboratories, but underground's a little different. But somehow it gets from the source rock to areas above, so that oil could have been generated from. They probably could fingerprint that oil and see where it came from. They kind of run it through the machine and see what matches with which shale layer down below. And they probably have. They're just not going to tell anybody. Because a lot of that they keep proprietary. Yes, ma'am.
So I think when I heard you the last time you were talking about global warming, you did not support that there's global warming going on. And I don't know if that was you or somebody else.
It might be, but I don't think it's caused by humans.
Okay, because
it goes up and down. There's 500-year cycles of warming and cooling for the last 2,000 years. A lot of it ties directly. I had a whole presentation on that I give my students usually. It ties to solar radiation cycles a lot better than anything else. And so a lot of it has to do with how much radiation is coming from the sun, and that fluctuates, and that's what causes these cycles of heating and cooling. Someone mentioned the other night, even the planets around us are heating up too. Why would they be heating up? Unless we're burning fossil fuels over there on Venus.
Because I know when I scuba dive in the coral reefs where I dive every year, in the last 3 years, it's like they're decimated. And the water temperature is just warm enough now that they can't survive, and it just breaks my heart.
Well, they'll move somewhere else though. The thing is they move. That's been going on for thousands of years since the flood. There are cycles of warming and cooling. There's been 500 years. There was a little ice age for 500 years just before the last 150 years. Everything was cooling for 500 years. And before that, there was the medieval warming period between 850 or so to 1350. Everything was warming, just like kind of it's doing now. So it is warming, but I don't think it's caused by humans.
Can the reefs move up here? Because I would like that. Then it'd be closer to swim to them.
Say that again?
Then the reefs, if they're going to move, they can move up closer to us.
If it's warming, if you're in those warming cycles like we appear to be, everything's going to shift, north more because it'll be longer growing seasons and everything else for a while. So that's why the Vikings went to Greenland in 1850 to 1300 because it was warming. And then the next 500 years it got colder again. They call it the Little Ice Age. Everything was expanding again. Glaciers in Europe were coming down the valleys and getting bigger and bigger. Everything was growing bigger, so they had to leave. A lot of them left. But for a while it was warming up. And so that cycle has continued since the time of Jesus. You see 500 years of warming, cooling, 500 years. And Al Gore starts all of his curves right when the Little Ice Age ends. You had 500 years of cooling, so of course it's going to start warming again. You're in the cycle of where it's warming. But he tries to blame it on you. So you got to pay more money. You got to pay more taxes. A sin tax on burning fossil fuels. You know, carbon sequestering. All these guys, my geology colleagues at Western Michigan, are all trying to find places to sequester carbon. I mean, it's pointless. You know,
So
the plants love it. Why are we
Michigan's the
sequestering?
place to be, man.
That's right. Well, if it gets warmer for a while, that's fine.
Yeah.
You know, it gives you a longer growing season.
Yeah.
You can get 2 seasons of navy beans in. They grow pretty fast. You can do that twice. You get your wheat out and get those navy beans in right away, you might have time to get them out. I think that's what I'd try if I was a farmer. Get the winter wheat out, get those navy beans in right away. They mature until just before the frost comes in, maybe it's end of September. Risky. That's my advice to all farmers. Take advantage of the warming. But actually, it depends where you measure it. There's a lot of people that argue that it's not really doing that. But some places it is getting warmer. And there is an impact, of course, if we're burning things and we're overdoing things, you're going to get some influence from humans. But I think most of it is not caused by humans. They try to say it is all the time, but how do you tell? And they don't measure how much is being released from rocks. They don't even, to me, I think that's a bigger factor, releasing CO2. I think some of those flood rocks are releasing that CO2 back. So in the pre-flood world, you had lots of CO2, lots of oxygen, and everything was flourishing. So warmer is not necessarily a bad thing. But the animals would just move. The coral reefs, they die in some areas. Just like Mammoth Hot Springs, you go there, and the water changes direction, and suddenly the hot springs over here turn ugly gray, and all the bacteria dies. And so then it starts to flourish over here. So wherever the water is kind of producing things. The same thing is true, everything will shift. God's got checks and balances on all these things. Animals come and go, but they're little corals. It is kind of sad.
Well, they say it produces a lot of oxygen, the corals do, so everybody always freaks there's not going to be enough oxygen.
Well, plants make more oxygen. So if you give the plants the CO2 they want, then they're going to make us more oxygen. And there actually are more plants now. I've heard studies done. There's more plants now in the world than there has been in a long time because of the CO2 volume has gone up. So they're flourishing a little bit better. That's what they need to breathe. And then they produce the oxygen for us. The algae is producing oxygen out there in the oceans. And so we need all that algae that's in the oceans. They're producing most of the world's oxygen for us. So if they're happier with more CO2, then we're all happier. Any last minute questions?
Yeah, I got one for you. So I very much enjoyed this, but it seems like you've taken the philosophy that God was right, the Bible was right, and then you went and tried to do all your research to validate that. Was there ever a time that you didn't quite have that solidified?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I talk about that to some audiences. I admit my fear. I first started doing the column project and compiling these columns. And so I know the Bible talks about a global flood, and I believe that. But I said, I'm going to start looking at the rocks. And I was thinking, I sure hope the rocks show a global flood. And for a moment there, I was a little bit like, well, I don't know. Let's see what the rocks really do show. Do they show a global flood? And so I started plotting up the data. And once I got across North America, I realized it does. And I did another continent. I'm like, wow, it does the same thing. I did another continent. It does the same thing. That's why I wrote that carved in stone book. You can see the patterns after 3 continents. Every continent pretty much doing the same thing. Leaving the same rocks in the same order. I mean, what better evidence for a global flood than the same thing happening on every continent at the same time? Burying the same animals at the same levels at the same time. And you see this progressive flood, which we never knew. But I had a moment there the first 6 months, I was like, I don't know if this is going to work. I certainly hope it does. The Bible says there's a global flood. Well, because I believe it, but I had to kind of step out on a little bit of weak faith. I was like Peter, I would have sank. Because I didn't have enough faith until I started plotting up the data, and then it really started revealing itself. That why did I ever doubt? But I had my doubts. I thought, so I hope the rocks show up. And they did. Yes, sir. Mike, fire away.
Yeah, I have a question about Grand Canyon.
I don't need the I'm pretty loud.
If the people in the back want to hear you.
Okay.
I realize that there's quite a few layers of rocks in the Grand Canyon, and there's a lot of different colors. What creates all the different colors in the layers? Like I hear there's reds and grays and tans and.
Well, the red, like the red wall, that rock is gray. You break up a fresh piece, it's gray. It's being stained by the red rocks above it. Those hermit shale, that's all red, and all that leaks down.
Okay.
Supai group leaks down. There's a lot of iron in it. There's a lot of oxidized iron that was deposited in those rocks. Part of the cements holding those rocks together had a lot of oxidized iron in it. And so that's what's making a lot of the reds. Some of the rocks are green because they, lack of oxygen. They're more anoxic.
Because of
conditions
what?
when they were being deposited. So there wasn't much oxygen in some cases. A lot of the reds come from, which is very common in a lot of rocks, comes from iron, oxidized iron. Just like you guys get in your groundwater, right?
I hear there's even some black, though. What's the black from?
Well, the black is from the organics. That's those organic rich layers that had marine algae, and those rocks were buried deep enough that they got cooked, and they kind of look like, they're almost like coal layers sometimes. They're so dark. They're so full of organic debris. That's the kerogen that, if it's algae and plankton, that's oil-prone rocks. If you bury that at the right depth, you're going to get oil generated from it.
What's the tan color from then?
The tan?
Somebody told me there's tan in it.
Well, there's pretty much every color.
Yeah, I know.
There's even purple rocks, and so you get a lot of these are different.
Oh, that would be cool.
Aluminum, different elements in the cements. A lot of them are. Some of the rocks are caused by changes in metamorphism. There are different minerals that get cooked, and you get different. Just a little bit of impurities changes the mineral colors dramatically. So you can get even some of the minerals like quartz can be 10 different colors.
Are the purple rocks then other things than amethyst?
Well, you can get purple shales even there. They have
okay,
different minerals in them that changes the color of the rock to a purple color. You can get pink rocks, like the Kona dolomite. It's got iron in it, makes everything really pretty. And you can get, I think God loves colors.
Yeah.
He made all this, the layers. To a geologist, it's all color coded. You get used to which layers are red in Wyoming. These are Triassic rocks. You find these rocks, and you get the right order. You can tell exactly where you are. Once you learn the section in one area, you can go to the next area. Some of them continue. There's some new things from place to place, but some of those rocks go all the way across our whole country, as we saw. And so they're very consistent. To me, the best explanation for that is a massive flow, flood that flooded the whole area at the same time. But you get a lot of variety in the colors because you get different water coming in, have different iron. Some might all has to do with the oxidation state of some of those minerals that are coming in. Some of it's very acidic. During the flood, there was all these acids and different things we don't even know because the water is no longer there to really test, but we can see the minerals left behind in the rocks. So some of that color comes from the different, some of the fountains of the deep may be producing the acids. We don't really know. A lot of people say a lot of things, but when it comes right to it, the rocks kind of tell the story. But there's a lot more we need to clean out of those rocks.
My wife likes to go to a lot of rock shows, and I went with her with one, and one of the guys there had amethyst, and he told me amethyst is almost always found underwater. I wonder if they could have anything like that because of the flood.
Well, you get groundwater as well under the ground. Once you reach the water table, everything's underwater.
Okay.
And so everything's wet for the most part at that point. So you can get amethyst. I don't know if that's true or not, but it may be true. But it's just got an impurity in it. It's quartz. Your purest quartz is clear. And then you get milky quartz, you get amethyst, you get red quartz, which is jasper. You get iron in it. You get the color. So I always used to tell the students, don't rely on color for most of your minerals because it's going to fool you. It can be blue quartz even. So all these different colors because of just a little impurity mixed in there. So that changes the rocks too.
You mentioned Pangea yesterday, and I'm wondering, when did the continents divide?
Got the microphone? Oh, I couldn't see, you're hiding. Well, I think during the flood year, they broke apart during the flood. Early on, there wasn't much movement because you don't see a lot of new ocean crust forming early on, but there was obviously some movement because you have Appalachians formed early in the flood, and the Urals formed early in the flood. There must have been some small plate collisions moving around. I believe almost all the plate movement happened as God cracked open their fountains of the deep burst all over the earth. He broke the plates. A solid earth would have been broken to plates. And Earth's the only planet with tectonic plates. There's no other planet that has tectonic plates, which I think is, points to there was only one flood on any of the planets. That, I don't believe Mars necessarily flooded like they say. I don't see the water there. But I think they moved during the flood year, and once, again, the whole new ocean crust was gone, by the end of the receding phase, everything kind of stopped. And so all that cold crust is gone. Now you have all hot crust, and everything kind of stopped. You can't pull the hot crust down on the earth. And so it's driven by this subduction process, this runaway subduction John Baumgartner modeled. I think all that happened in the year of the flood, with just this much movement happening since. But there's still big earthquakes, because they're still building up energy, that little bit of 60-mile thick plates moving around like a Rubik's Cube. You move it over here, it's going to affect over here. Everything all works together.
Just a question. I heard like a book say that if all the valleys were pushed up and all the mountains were pushed down, that water would cover the entire earth. What do you say to that in a global flood?
Well, are you talking about the Bible, talking about that in Psalms? Or are you talking about
I heard someone say that, like, if all the valleys were pushed up and all the mountains were pushed down, that water would cover.
If you flatten the earth completely, the earth would be flooded.
Because
the oceans are so deep. Oceans average like 2.3 miles deep of water. As soon as you step off the shore, even though it's very shallow there's so much deeper water out there that the oceans average over 2 miles deep.
Right.
And
so
all that water, if you push that up and you flattened out the mountains, you easily would flood the whole earth. I forget exactly how high.
So mountains and valleys were created during the flood, right?
Yes.
Okay.
The current mountains and the valleys we see today all happened during the flood year.
She had a question.
So when you were on your trip to the Grand Canyon, there was a picture of the water kind of a chocolatey color. Is that because it was diluted, or is there another reason for that?
No, it's because a lot of rain. A lot of rain washed in all this mud from the side canyons all the way in. That was really fun to wash your hair in. But it's like, what's the point? And so, but it was because all the side canyons were washed in a lot of this mud and debris that builds up. They only get so much rain every year in Grand Canyon, but they get a lot of it in about 2 months' time. July and August usually is what they call the monsoons. So that washes a lot of the debris in. But they don't get, sometimes they get a flash flood. That can be very hazardous. People get trapped in those. Hikers were caught, I think, last year, the Havasu Canyon, the year before. And some of them, I don't know if they got them all out or not. Somebody drowned, I can't remember. But they have their own flash floods once in a while. They got to be very careful of. So when we're on these raft trips, they're always monitoring that. There's a lot of rain. They tell us to get out of there, get on the boats. And so we don't get washed away.
Yeah.
That too, Rob?
Yeah. So Tim, can you explain, as rich of copper as the Keweenaw is, all the mines and everything up there?
Good stuff up there.
And, talking to a lot of the natives up there and stuff like that, they used to be able to find copper right on the surface. How do you explain the copper that, it didn't come from underground, but it got there somehow?
Right, it came up a lot. A lot of it got moved by the glaciers again.
Okay.
There's big hunks of it they found in Lake Superior, that big chunk that's like, I don't know how big it is, so many tons they pulled out of Lake Superior. A lot of that got moved by the glaciers. Yeah,
and then it got dropped.
Right, and so but these veins of copper came up in the fractures in the lava flows. A lot of it came up in these lava flows. Exactly why there's copper there, it's pure copper in Michigan. That's what's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And there's evidence that these things were being mined on Isle Royal, probably right after the dispersal of humans.
All right.
And they were mining this stuff to make bronze. And so I read about a ship that sank off Cyprus that's 90% copper, pure copper. They only find that copper in Michigan. And this is, thousands of years old, even before the Phoenicians. And they had 10% tin. So that's the recipe for bronze. So they were fueling the Bronze Age right off the bat. I think they were sailing over to North America. They explored a lot more than we give them credit for right after the Tower of Babel. That's why they set up Stonehenge and all these things. So they could tell when to sail over, when to sail back. And then we forgot. They didn't write it down. So we forgot about this country over here. And so they had to rediscover it several times. And but I think there are people who were using resources right after the Tower of Babel more than we think. Because there's all these big pits on Nile Rail that they date at 3,000 years or more, way back. Stonehenge, all these structures, and even in Spain where they could sail across using the trade winds and come back. And they weren't just using these for sacrifices; they were using them to tell the time of year, so they knew when to travel as well. And so people were pretty smart. We just don't give them credit. We think they're just Stone Age, people just lumbering around. Though they did Stone Age because that's all when they had to disperse. That's all they had until they stayed in caves for a while because that was immediate housing. And so some of them stayed in those for a long time, and many of them forgot how to do anything else other than use Stone Age tools. So all these cultures all over the world, they're using Stone Age cultures. Eventually, that's in Europe they developed cannons and rifles and all this kind of stuff, and better weaponry. But over here, the Stone Age cultures were working for the local tribes, and so they were trying to get better weapons to defeat the neighboring tribe from the French and the British when they came over. There's a long history that it's very complicated. But a lot of it's all because of the dispersal, and they forgot. There was an article I read about one of the last African slaves that was brought over. They did an interview with him in the 30s. He was one of the last slaves they brought over illegally during the Civil War even. They bought him. There's another tribe, slaughtered his whole family and cut their heads off and sold him into slavery to the Dutch or whoever it was. And he came across to New Orleans and they smuggled him in. And all they wanted to do was go back to Africa. They just wanted to go back. And when the war ended, they're like, we don't have any land. What are we going to do? And so they finally had to work hard for a while to buy land. And he said the best thing about him coming to our country was he learned about Jesus. He says, we forgot. In Africa, my people forgot. He goes, but coming here, I was reminded again about Jesus. So he became a Christian because of all that route. But he says, we all forgot. Everybody can look at the stars, you can see the Creator. It says in Romans 1. Nobody can deny. Atheists try to claim there is no God, but they know there is. They know there's a Creator that created even their hands. How do you get a hand that works like we can do? It's just amazing what God made, and yet we think that it just happened. It's just amazing. We look at paintings, you're like, oh, obviously somebody painted that. When you look at the human body, which is, a million times more complex, and we're like, oh, that just happened. It's amazing how we fooled ourselves, dumbed ourselves down to believe these stories that mainstream science is telling us. And, so that's why ICR, we're here to tell you that, God's word is true. That what he said exactly is what happened, and that's the flood was real. Even though I had my doubts early on, it was more real than I ever thought. And so I get the best job in the world. I get to go around and tell people there really was a global flood. You can believe your Bible, because that's what the rocks really do show. Even though I doubted it for a while, until I started plotting up the data, I'm like, wow. It was like opening a Christmas present every time I get a continent done. That's the kind of nerd I am. It's like, this was awesome, because then you finally get to see how it all laid out and what was deposited where, and you can start seeing what flooded first, and those are all marine fossils. Those must have been shallow seas, and this area didn't flood till later. You start to see land animals, so that was the swampy areas, and you find dinosaurs in there, and you can plot up exactly where dinosaurs are found all over the earth based on the order of burial of the rocks. And you can find where the upland areas are. Areas like Canada, they got stripped right down to the crust of Scandinavia. In Greenland, they were all one big continental mass, Canada, Scandinavia, and Greenland. That was high ground where probably humans were living, and most of our common mammals like horses and camels living at the high elevations with the different plants up there than we saw where the dinosaurs were living. And there wasn't a lot of mixing, because who's going to stray far from your food source? If this is your food source, even though you're a T-Rex, you're still eating plants. Because crocodiles and alligators today still eat plants. They dissect them, they're like, how come they're still eating plants? Because that's what God designed them to do. But unfortunately, they might not get all the nutrients they need from those plants, because you don't have the right plants in the right places anymore. I think that's one of the reasons why dinosaurs slowly got less and less and less, and I think humans ultimately killed them off. Because they're scary. Right? And you can impress the ladies. You can impress the ladies, any guy will do it. He's a teenager. When you get older, maybe not. Patrick, it was a pleasure.
Anybody? Just kidding. Okay,
They even fed us well.
what?
We made Colleen get up and make homemade waffles this morning while Pat was sleeping. He was up early.
Well,
you're a great host, Patrick.
Let's give Timothy a hand for coming.
I tried. I want to thank you all on behalf of ICR too for your offerings you gave to ICR. They're gonna, those will go in as donations. They're going to be really impressed with this church because they're like, wow, nobody does that. Nobody does that. They'll give us a honorarium, and that's about it, and we leave, and we're more than happy with anything, whether it's nothing or anything. But you guys far exceeded anything we ever would expect. You guys have given and given again, and you suffered through my talks. Some of them were a pain, I understand, but some of them were kind of fun. But I appreciate you guys sticking with it to the bitter end, as I say, to the bitter end. How's that go? What did Dad say? Hanging on like grim death?
Hang on like grim death.
Yeah. You guys hung on like grim death.
My father used to say, driving.
All right, Patrick.
I'm hanging on like grim death.
But you guys really have been a wonderful, wonderful group. Tell the people that left already that, thank you. Thank you all very much for being such great hosts, and Pat and Colleen and Katie Rose for hosting us all.
I'm going to pray here, Timothy, and then we'll be dismissed. Okay. Lord God, we do bless you. We thank you for the teaching. Thank you for your wonderful world and creation, and even seeing your hand in the rocks. We give you thanks. We thank you for Jesus above all. In his name we pray. Amen.
You're not supposed to do that right every day. Hopefully, we'll try somebody. You have a good family. We haven't met your other brother.